Listen, Disney, I mean, come on. Everyone knows I'm not the biggest fan of your live-action remakes. What makes you think that just because I like 101 Dalmatians means that I'm going to like Cruella? I mean, you've given it your best shot, right? You brought in Guy Ritchie, Kenneth Branagh, Jon Favreau, even pioneered cutting-edge VFX. I mean, maybe you should just quit. Oh, holy shit, this is amazing. It's London. It's the 70s. Punk rock is taking over, leaving the poshos in the dust. Enter Estella DeVille. An ambitious wonderkind of fashion design, Estella is forced to contend with the loss of her mother as a child, while rising to the top of the fashion world as the prodigy of Baroness von Hellman. That's all you need to know in order to connect the dots from Estella's final form, the iconic and deliciously evil Cruella DeVille from the immortal classic 101 Dalmatians, to the character we first meet in what is by far the best of Disney's live-action reboots to date, Cruella. But what makes Cruella such a resounding success? It'd be easy enough to highlight the fantastic performances from the Emmas, the film's unapologetically fond aesthetic of 70s London that's as much of a love letter to punk as it is to fashion, or the Youth and Revolt-styled screenplay that, in between its magnificent character work, sometimes plays like a documentary of how the punk movement changed London. And believe me, we're gonna talk about all of that. But as important as the film's victories are in their own right, we have to also understand why the previous remakes failed and how Cruella avoids those pitfalls. Disney have been struggling in the live-action department for a good decade. Back in the 90s, the studio had strong success with their first live-action interpretation of The Jungle Book, followed by, fittingly, 101 Dalmatians and its follow-up, 102 Dalmatians, both starring Glenn Close as the iconic villain Cruella. These latter two films weren't quite championed by critics at the time, but they were financially successful and have gone on to maintain a strong fan base, as well as a warmer reappraisal in the 20 years since. The 2010s, however, saw the studio really dig into the well with live-action remakes. 2010's Alice in Wonderland started the insanity, and that was followed by an absolute torrent of movies such as Cinderella, another Jungle Book remake, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, Aladdin, Maleficent, and Lady and the Tramp. There's a common thread between most of these films. They're lifeless. They don't chart new territory or give us something interesting to chew on with their characters like those 90s films did. They tend to be lacking in production values, and ultimately, they're just hollow copy and paste remakes that only manage to make you wish you were watching the original animated film instead. Cruella, on the other hand, isn't guilty of any of the above sins. For one, it's largely telling an origin story. Sure, you can pinpoint some inspiration from Joker, both aesthetically and thematically, and the overall concept of the film could be summed up as Cruella begins, but this is largely an exciting new angle for the character, giving us an in-depth look at a period of the character's life that has gotten barely a mention beforehand. Suffice it to say, this doesn't feel like another hollow Disney remake because, well, it's not really a remake at all. For all of the 101 Dalmatians plot threads it sets up, you're never watching this movie and coming across sequences lifted from that 1961 classic. You're certainly not sitting there going, well, I really just wish I was watching that film instead. Ultimately, what Cruella is doing that its predecessors failed to is it takes a character we all know and love to hate and lets us go deep into her psyche. Cruella, by taking us deep into the character, reminds us that she is so much more than just that archetype. She's a complex and even in some ways sympathetic character, which is necessary of almost any great villain. There's a reason her character is the way it is, why she does things she does, why Estella became Cruella. It didn't happen on a dime, and as the movie shows, she really tried to live a good life at first. It's the circumstances around her that awakened a dormant villainy and set her on a collision course with destiny to become the iconic villain. Her arc ties into the London punk scene as well. It's not just for the awesome soundtrack or glorious aesthetic that the film is set during such a pivotal time, it's also perfectly copacetic with Cruella's personality and with her narrative. The London punk scene was filled with anarchists and anti-establishment figures, attitudes that come through in the film. No one goes and takes on the government during the film or anything, but the establishment is personified in the Baroness. She's the elegant, posh, monarch-like figure with a giant mansion, dozens of servants, a guard detail that follows her everywhere, and a seemingly limitless supply of power in the fashion industry. Estella, and especially Cruella, are the anarchists, dismantling the Baroness's power from within, getting rid of the exploitative power structure the latter controls and taking over, and in true punk rock fashion, she does it boldly, loudly, angrily, and with gushingly endless style. It's this youthful revolt that you see happening in full swing. After all, Cruella is no older than her early 20s, if even that, for a majority of the film. She's smack dab in the middle of the rebellion of punk, of an explosion of individuality that overcomes the attitude of conformity that the world was living in through much of the 50s and 60s. It's a microcosm, in a way, of Estella and Cruella dueling to take control of the majority of the other's personality. It's represented visually in the simple black and white color palette of the character, which is tied into the essence of Cruella herself. Most notably, as Cruella begins to overtake Estella, more and more color finds its way into her world and that of the film, particularly red tones. She's a character being pulled in two different directions: who she's told to be, who she's forced to be, versus who she wants to be and who she needs to be, who ultimately has to go one way over the other. Cruella could never permanently conform, just like the punk rock scene never could. The individuality has to win out in the end. It's actually quite bold and genius on the part of Disney, and especially on the part of director Craig Gillespie. Gillespie isn't a stranger to villainous figures, nor to the exploration of shakeups within institutions. After all, he comes into Cruella off the heels of I, Tonya, an exploration of a real-life villain in Tonya Harding, who at best obscured and at worst participated in her husband's conspiracy to injure Nancy Kerrigan. While Cruella arguably paints its titular character with far more gray, making her villainy less clear-cut than that of Tonya Harding, it also serves as an escalation of the director's previous films, broadening the scale of its establishment shakeup into borderline anarchy and absolute chaos for its central antagonist. Gillespie himself says, "I keep being attracted to these outsiders and these misunderstood characters. Once you analyze a narrative of how they got to those choices that they made in their life, I think oftentimes it's hard not to be empathetic. A lot of times, it's good people doing bad things. That's an adage I believe in. I'm not condoning what they're doing, but it gives you a chance to kind of root for them even though you wouldn't necessarily make those choices." Not to mention that Cruella is a stylistic and musical feast, taking the style of Gillespie's idol, Martin Scorsese, particularly that of Goodfellas, and blowing it up to epic punk proportions. I was like, how much music can I get away with? I watched the first hour of Goodfellas and it's just back-to-back songs. I was surprised. Gillespie followed suit, giving us a soundtrack that is always propelling us forward. The film gloriously features everyone from The Clash to Blondie to Supertramp to the Zombies to Nina Simone to, perhaps most iconically, The Stooges, over long tracking shots and stylistic shot compositions that evoke not only Scorsese and Goodfellas, but the new Hollywood era of the 70s that British cinema, London cinema, would often find itself capitalizing on in its own movies. The filmmaking of Cruella is ambitious and beautifully executed. The flat production of the last few live-action remakes, gone. The forgettable performances, everyone in the cast brings their A-game, especially Emma Stone and Emma Thompson. The film's locations are lush, the visuals crisp, the effects, in the sparing, tasteful moments where effects are even used, minus those questionable CGI dogs, glorious and modern. Even The Lion King has aged poorly in just 2 years, whereas Cruella features standout costumes and is a technical marvel akin to the best Disney films of years gone by. Films like the new Beauty and the Beast and Lady and the Tramp are already fading away, while Cruella shines as bright and as loud as the iconic, vicious furs she wears. And the other reason the film works is that even though it's looking at Cruella from a new vantage point, it's still presenting us with a believable version of her character that is faithful to who she turns out to be. I don't want to just keep harping on the inferiority of the other live-action remakes, but I think there's one in particular we should look at and examine why it didn't work where Cruella does, and that film is Maleficent. Now look, I know a lot of people enjoy Maleficent, and that's great. It's technically probably one of the better Disney live-action remakes. It just has one particularly glaring problem. It turns its protagonist, the Mistress of Evil, one of the most iconic villains not only in Disney's catalog or in animation, but in film in general, into a hero? In the original Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent places a curse on Princess Aurora out of spite for being snubbed by her kingdom. She follows this up by abducting the one person who can save Aurora, her lover Philip, and goes on to fight to her literal last in order to try and doom Aurora. The 2014 film flips the script. Maleficent still places the curse on Aurora and sets its impact on her in motion, but has a change of heart, brought about by the remake completely changing how a bunch of other characters are portrayed, and ultimately, herself ends up being the one who saves Aurora. In essence, Maleficent goes from being an iconic villain to the redeemed hero of her own story? It's a fundamental betrayal of what made the narrative of Sleeping Beauty work, and in turn, doesn't really work at all in the film. It was different for different sake, and that's something that almost never works in a film, especially when you're dealing with such a famous property and such an iconic, distinct character. Cruella, on the other hand, works because it takes the same character we know, even sets her on the same path that we associate her with from her previous films, and just adds sympathy and understanding to how Estella became Cruella. If that seems overly simplistic, well, one, I don't want to spoil the movie, and two, it kind of just is simple. Both of these films try to do something similar with an iconic Disney villain, but one goes too far off the path and, as a result, fundamentally changes its lead character, whereas the other simply expands its lead character and gives her more depth. Art is subjective, for sure, but for me, Cruella does a far better job at playing with the character we know without turning her into something we no longer recognize. What Cruella should teach Disney is that you can make a live-action remake of these films, and it can be awesome, but you've got to make it stand out. You've got to treat these characters, and doubly so, given how iconic they are, like fully fleshed people. You've got to play in their sandbox, dig deep, and find a new angle to approach them from. Tell a new story. Don't just lazily adapt what's already been there and try to top what can't be topped. Follow Craig Gillespie's lead. Make a bespoke narrative out of these iconic films instead. Build the characters from that new angle you found, and, if need be, bring us up to a familiar place once all is said and done, rather than starting off there and just rehashing the familiar. In other words, embrace individuality and punk it up, just like Cruella would. Hold up. Our main character loses an important family member as a child, gets sent to a fantastical and whimsical London, and ends up with an unlikely family while facing off against a figure connected to her earlier life and family? Cruella is a spiritual successor to Paddington? I knew it! Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. While Cruella might not be a perfect film, I do think that it is one of the most successful and one of the more enjoyable and one of the more inventive Disney live-action films we've gotten in a very long time. Definitely one of the better, remakes, whatever you want to call it. It's not really a remake, so you can't call it a live-action remake, but along those lines. But the most important thing is, what did you all think? Be sure to let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below. Did you like it? Did you hate it? It's actually been a little... The reception to this film's been a little bit more mixed than I anticipated, but that's the beauty of film. So be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. And while you're down there, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Film Speak channel so you don't miss out on more video essays such as this, TV talk, interviews, all that stuff. We like to say this is the place where the conversation continues after the credits, and of course, we'd love to have you be a part of that conversation. So consider subscribing to the channel. I believe the next video we're going to be tackling here is going to be on F9. And boy, do I have words to say about that film. So you'll be getting that in probably in a week or so. So look forward to that. But until then, if you like me specifically and you like what I have to say, you can give me a follow on Twitter at Griff Schiller. All right, that's going to do it for this video, guys. And I will catch you next time. Take care.